They said it was just another city on the Volga. They were wrong. It was the edge of the world. Autumn, 1942. The Volga is no longer a river. It's the pulse of the war. Stalingrad stands between two hammers. The Wehrmacht and despair itself. Every street is a front, every house a fortress. In this inferno, a new physics of war was born, where space wasn't measured in kilometers but in floors. Stalingrad wasn't just a city, it was an idea. For Hitler, a symbol that Germany could crush the Soviet Union. For Stalin, a line that could never under any circumstance be crossed. If Stalingrad fell, everything else would crumble. When General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army entered the city, it brought 330,000 men, 500 tanks, 200 aircraft, and 7,000 artillery
pieces. Here is the target.
Pieces.
We must advance.
It wasn't an assault. It was a slow incineration of a living city. The Germans took buildings meter by meter, losing thousands of men for every block. On the Soviet side, exhausted but unbroken soldiers clung to the western bank of the Volga. Supplies and reinforcements came only across the river, under constant bombardment. The smell of ash, gunpowder, and blood mixed into the air so thick you could taste it. Stalingrad was breathing, but every breath was smoke. From Berlin, the campaign looked simple. Stalingrad will fall within a week, General Halder wrote in his diary. A month later, he crossed that line out. The Wehrmacht had no idea what kind of war it had entered. This was not front versus front, it was floor versus floor. On average, 40,000 soldiers fought per square kilometer of ruined city. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a grinder made of concrete and fear. Grenades were thrown across hallways. Knives replaced rifles. Pistols barked through kitchen walls. Ordinary buildings became citadels. Concrete panels riddled with bullet holes held not walls, but memory. Names of strong points began to echo across the front. The grain elevator, the Red October factory, the Gerhardt mill, the house of Pavlov. But back then, Pavlov's house wasn't a legend. It was just another apartment block on 9th of January Square. A 4-story brick building stripped of windows, half collapsed. To commanders, it was a tactical detail. To history, it would become a symbol of human endurance. The German advance turned the city to rubble. Luftwaffe bombers dropped over 1,000 tons of explosives in a single day. By September, Stalingrad was a skeleton, but the defense did not collapse. Every house a fortress, every cellar a bastion. That wasn't a slogan. It was reality. The Red Army had learned to weaponize chaos. Destroyed walls became natural fortifications. Streets full of debris slowed tanks to a crawl. The Germans' strength, mobility, was gone. Now the war was fought at arm's length. When the Wehrmacht reached the Volga, they didn't find victory, and they found hell. The battlefront moved 50 to 100 meters a day, then fell back again. Men fought until their rifles melted, until their hands bled. Day and night blurred into one long bombardment. The sound of artillery was constant, like a heartbeat. German letters home spoke of disbelief. This is not war. This is madness. The Russians fight from every corner, every shadow. Moscow's orders were clear. Not one step back. Order number 227. Stalin's command that turned the city into a moral wall. There was nowhere to retreat. Behind the soldiers lay the Volga, and behind that nothing but shame. They fought knowing the only way out was forward. Each ruined street became sacred ground. By October, German troops had reached the very banks of the river. Soviet soldiers across the water could see the smoke rising from the apartment building that would soon become known as Pavlov's house. It wasn't yet defended, but it would be. Stalingrad had no addresses anymore. Every structure was a tomb. Between August and November 1942, over 600,000 people died, soldiers and civilians alike. The ground shook constantly. The Volga glowed orange from phosphorus bombs. But no German unit crossed it. No matter how hard they pushed, the defenders held on. To ruins, to basements, to single bricks. And in one of those ruins, a group of Soviet soldiers under Sergeant Yakov Pavlov decided that this building, this single square of earth, would not fall. Not for one day, not for 1 hour. Historians later claimed Pavlov's house didn't change the outcome of the battle. But they missed the point. It changed something far greater, the morale of an entire army. It showed the world what endurance looked like when victory seemed impossible. It turned survival itself into a strategy. While the armies clashed in the ruins, one small platoon dug into the bricks and began to carve a legend. One that would outlast the city, the war, and even the empire they fought for. This house was nothing special. An ordinary brick building among hundreds of others, broken, blackened, with empty eye sockets of windows. But it was here, on 25 September 1942, that a group of fighters under the command of Sergeant Yakov Pavlov turned the ruins into an impregnable fortress. What began as a minor episode of assault would become the most famous defense of the Second World War. In the ruins of Stalingrad, even a single wall could change the war. When Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, a 24-year-old from Novgorod, received orders to reconnoiter a building overlooking 9th January Square, it wasn't supposed to be history. His mission: find a vantage point to cover the Volga crossing from German fire. But once inside, he realized whoever held this house controlled the approach to the river. The building was perfect and suicidal at once, 4 stories high with clear sight lines across the square, but surrounded by open ground, exposed on all sides to German tanks, snipers, and mortars. Still, Pavlov decided to stay. The assault team, 4 men at first, stormed the lower floor under machine gun fire. By nightfall, they had cleared it. By dawn, the Germans counterattacked with tanks and flamethrowers. The Soviets had only grenades and rifles, no anti-tank weapons, no heavy support. Yet they held. Reinforcements trickled in: machine gunners, anti-tank riflemen, sappers. Among them, Lieutenant Ivan Afanasyev, who would formally take command, and Sergeant Pavlov, who became the beating heart of the defense. By October, 24 men occupied the house. They turned it into a fortress. Every window became a firing position, every room a strong point. They sealed the staircases with rubble and mines, cut new firing holes in the walls, and linked the basement to Soviet trenches at the rear with a communication trench 80 meters long, dug by hand under fire at night. They nicknamed it the Corridor of Life. Through it came ammunition, food, and reinforcements, and through it wounded men were dragged back to safety. The Germans attacked daily, sometimes 5-6 times a day. Tanks rolled up to the entrance, firing point blank. Flamethrowers scorched the walls until they glowed red. Each time, the defenders waited until the tanks were close enough, then hurled Molotovs and anti-tank grenades through shattered windows. Inside, the air was smoke and dust. Walls trembled. Men counted ammunition like breaths. For 58 days, they held the house, completely surrounded, cut off, and outnumbered. They had no running water, no electricity, no relief. Supplies came across the Volga under artillery fire. They melted ice for drinking water. Rations were measured by the spoon. Sometimes they lived on one biscuit and a handful of dried peas per day. And yet, they never broke. Each defender knew his sector by heart. They named every firing position: north window, sniper's hole, the furnace, the basement point. The Germans knew them too. They called the building the fortress. They attacked it with infantry, artillery, and Stuka bombers. They even tried tunneling under it. But the defenders listened for vibrations and countermined by sound. They had turned defense into choreography, a rhythm of fire, reload, and silence. One German officer later wrote in disbelief, "We spent more men taking a single house than some armies spend taking a city." The house became a symbol of the entire battle. Radio operators transmitted updates from its basement. Pavlov's men still hold the house. Each message echoed across the front like a heartbeat. In Moscow, the story spread. In villages thousands of kilometers away, mothers told their children, "There's a house in Stalingrad that hasn't fallen." German maps marked it as a fortified point. For the Red Army, it became sacred ground. Even Chuikov, the commander of the 62nd Army, called it a miniature fortress within a fortress. It wasn't just stone and brick anymore. It was defiance turned into architecture. By November, the defenders' rifles were fused from heat. Their hands cracked from frost. But the house still stood. Its walls looked like lace, shredded by bullets, blackened by fire. Yet it refused to die. And as the Soviet counter-offensive, Operation Uranus, began to encircle the German Sixth Army, the men inside the house realized they had done the impossible. They had survived long enough for the tide to turn. Pavlov's house became the point where the war ceased to be nameless. Within these walls, time stopped. Not hours, but days lived on the brink of the impossible. When tourists come here years later and see bricks pierced by bullets, they will not see walls. They will see the people who held the front for the whole of Stalingrad. What it meant to live inside a war that never slept. 58 days. Not weeks, not operations, but days where every minute lasted an eternity. This is not a story about gunshots, but about people trapped between life and death. About a house that breathed gunpowder and a war where even silence killed. They didn't live in Pavlov's house. They endured it. Inside, time had no meaning. Daylight and night were one, broken only by the flash of artillery. Dust hung in the air like fog. The walls trembled every hour. And beneath those walls, 24 Soviet soldiers lived like shadows, sealed inside their own tomb. The house was surrounded on all sides. The nearest Soviet line, 80 meters away, across open ground swept by machine guns. Crossing it was suicide, so the defenders built their own world. The basement became a command post. The second floor, sniper and machine gun nests. The top floor, artillery observers and riflemen. Every window had a name, every floor a mission. They lived in a map of death. Their enemies were everywhere, not just outside, but above, below, and behind. German units occupied nearby buildings and cellars. The two sides were so close that they could hear each other breathe through the walls. Sometimes they'd shout insults, other times eerie silence. And that silence was worse. They slept in shifts, on rubble. Their beds were sandbags, their blankets, smoke and dust. Every morning began the same way. A single word over the field telephone. Alive. That was the report. Not ready, not safe, just alive. Food was rationed like gold. 1 tin of meat for 10 men. Bread frozen into bricks had to be cut with bayonets. Water came from melted snow scraped off window ledges. Sometimes they boiled machine gun barrels just to catch condensation. Every bullet mattered. Every grenade was a prayer. When supplies ran out, they scavenged German weapons from corpses, right under sniper fire. And yet somehow there was life. Private Alexei Chernyshov kept a small notebook of poems. Another soldier, Semen Naumov, carved chess pieces from spent cartridges. In one corner, a makeshift radio receiver hummed faintly, a lifeline to the outside world. At night, they'd listen to static and voices from across the Volga. Sometimes music, sometimes orders, sometimes nothing at all. The Germans came again and again. Artillery, flamethrowers, tanks. Once they drove a tank right up to the wall, fired point blank, and missed. The blast blew out what was left of the windows, but the defenders still held. They fought back like ghosts, slipping between rooms, using holes blasted through the walls as passageways. They moved silently, always changing positions so that the Germans never knew how many were left inside. At times, there were barely 10 men standing. But the Germans didn't know that. To them, the house seemed to hold an entire regiment, and that illusion was as deadly as any bullet. Commander Chvikov once joked, "The Germans lost more men taking Pavlov's house than they did taking Paris." It wasn't far from truth. As winter deepened, temperatures dropped below 30 degrees Celsius. The house froze from within, the walls coated in frost, the breath of the men forming mist in the air. But frost had one advantage. It sealed the smell of death. Beneath the floors, the bodies of fallen comrades lay buried in shallow pits, preserved by cold and silence. They were tired, starving, and half-frozen. But they were also famous. Across the Volga, Soviet loudspeakers blared, "Pavlov's men still hold their post." Those words became a weapon of morale. Every battalion knew the story. Every soldier whispered their names. The legend of Pavlov's house had grown larger than the war itself, and yet inside the house there was no glory, only endurance, no speeches, no songs, just the endless sound of mortars and the slow tick of survival. When a fresh shell hit, they didn't duck anymore. They just looked at each other, counted breaths, and went back to loading rifles. For them, fear had burned out, like a candle in a storm that never ends. By November, they could hear something new in the distance, the thunder of Soviet artillery. Operation Uranus had begun. For the first time in months, the wind carried hope. But hope was dangerous. It made you think there might still be a future. They didn't know it yet, but their 58-day defense was almost over. Not because they'd surrendered, but because the enemy would. 58 days. In normal life, 2 months. In war, an eternity. They endured not because they were immortal, but because they could not afford to die before the city would endure. Pavlov's house did not just stand. It lived, suffered, breathed together with those who defended it. When the hunters became the hunted by the winter of 1942, Stalingrad was not a city but a crater of history. Thousands of bodies lay beneath the ruins, and no one could distinguish where a man began and where the dust ended. But just when it seemed that no one had any strength left, the war made a sharp, almost impossible turn. Operation Uranus began. While one house held, an entire army prepared to strike back. The men in Pavlov's house didn't know it yet, but while they fought for every brick, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, was crafting something colossal. A counter-offensive not of meters, but of horizons. By mid-November 1942, the Red Army had built up 1 million soldiers, 2,500 tanks, 1,000 aircraft, and 14,000 guns around Stalingrad. They were hidden in the snow, spread across the steppe, waiting for the word that would change the course of the war. That word was Uranus. At dawn, November 19th, the sky cracked open. More than 3,500 artillery pieces fired at once. The earth shook. German soldiers later wrote that the snow itself seemed to explode. The Soviet plan was surgical. Strike the flanks of the German Sixth Army, not where it was strong, but where it was weak. Those flanks were held by Romanian and Italian divisions, poorly equipped, exhausted, and freezing. Within hours, they broke. Within days, the German lines began to collapse inward, not from defeat, but from fear. General Friedrich Paulus, trapped inside Stalingrad, did not understand what was happening, because no one ever told him it could happen. For months he had been promised reinforcements, supplies, and victory before winter. Now he received only silence. The Red Army moved fast, its armored columns slicing through the steppe like a blade through ice. Tanks covered 10-15 kilometers a day, a rate unheard of in snow and wind. Villages vanished into the white. German convoys burned in frozen ditches. And then, the trap closed. On November 23rd, two Soviet fronts, the southwestern and Stalingrad, met near the town of Kalach on the Don. The circle was complete. Inside it, the entire German Sixth Army. Over 300,000 men. Paulus was surrounded, cut off from supplies, fuel, and food. Temperatures dropped to 25 degrees. Engines froze, men starved, horses were slaughtered for meat. But the order from Hitler was absolute. Stalingrad must be held at all costs. To retreat was treason. To surrender, unthinkable. So they stayed, buried under snow, waiting for rescue that would never come. For the soldiers inside Pavlov's house, the change was almost imperceptible at first. The German attacks grew less frequent. Artillery quieter. Then, silence. They didn't celebrate. They didn't trust silence. It had killed too many before. Only later, when the Soviet scouts returned from the steppe, did they learn the hunters had become the hunted. The men who once surrounded them were now surrounded themselves. It was a reversal so total it rewrote the language of the war. For the first time, the Red Army was not defending. It was encircling. And Stalingrad, once a symbol of Soviet desperation, became a symbol of German despair. By December, the Germans attempted one last rescue, Operation Winter Storm. General Manstein, Hitler's best strategist, launched an armored thrust from the south. It advanced 50 kilometers, then froze. Soviet resistance was relentless. Fuel ran out. The cold finished the rest. Manstein withdrew. The Sixth Army was abandoned. Inside Stalingrad, the German soldiers wrote in their diaries, "We are forgotten. The sky has turned against us." They burned furniture for warmth. Ammunition froze solid. Men fought over crusts of bread. Wounded soldiers were stacked in cellars, their moans fading into the wind. The radio from Hitler's headquarters still promised victory, but the static grew louder. And then, one day, nothing. By January 1943, Paulus's army was starving. Men froze to death standing. They slept beside corpses for warmth. Entire regiments ceased to exist without a single shot fired. When Soviet troops finally stormed the last German positions, they found what one general called an empire of ghosts. On February 2nd, Paulus surrendered. It was the first time a German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Hitler had expected him to shoot himself. Instead, Paulus handed over his pistol and his army. Stalingrad was over. The snow was red. The wind carried no sound. Of the 330,000 German soldiers who entered the city, only 91,000 survived to surrender, and less than 6,000 ever returned home. The rest remained under the ruins, buried with the city they tried to conquer. The victory in Stalingrad was not a loud one. It was quiet, long-suffering, and terrible. On that day, not just the army collapsed, the myth collapsed. The myth of the invincibility of the Wehrmacht, of lightning warfare, of the superiority of strength over endurance. And in the midst of this horror stood a house that stood firm when an entire army fell. How a ruin became eternal. When the guns go silent, there is only silence. But sometimes in that silence you can hear the stone breathing. Pavlov's house survived. And with it survived the idea that even in hell there is a place for courage, and fortitude can be stronger than tanks. Wars end. But some buildings never stop fighting. After the surrender of Paulus, Stalingrad was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. The city was 99% destroyed. Of its 600,000 inhabitants, fewer than 10,000 were left alive. No streets, no roofs, no light, only smoke, snow, and silence. And in the middle of that silence, one building still stood. Pavlov's house. 4 stories of shattered brick, hollow rooms and walls riddled with more than 2,400 bullet holes. The men who had defended it emerged from the ruins like ghosts. Only 4 of the original defenders were still alive when the battle ended. But the house they defended had become more than a coordinate on a map. It had become a legend. Marshal Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army, later said in his memoirs, "While the Germans lost an army at Stalingrad, we gained a symbol that no army could ever destroy." In the weeks after victory, Soviet engineers inspected the ruins. They found shell casings used as makeshift cookware, walls reinforced with steel doors, and notes scribbled on plaster. "We're still here." The inscription became a monument in itself, a phrase that spoke for the entire city. Pavlov's house was rebuilt brick by brick on the same foundation where the original had stood. But one wall, the north wall, was left untouched. A scar of war preserved on purpose. Bullet holes sealed under glass. A living museum of endurance. Inside they placed a plaque. Here, from September to November 1942, a small group of Soviet soldiers defended this house for 58 days against enemy attacks. Simple words, but the weight behind them was immeasurable. In the decades that followed, the story of Pavlov's house grew into legend. Textbooks called it a symbol of the Soviet spirit. Foreign journalists dubbed it the house that stopped an army. To the veterans, it was neither. It was a memory too heavy to speak about. Yakov Pavlov himself returned home after the war. He received the title Hero of the Soviet Union, but lived quietly, avoiding attention. When asked what he remembered most, he said, "The silence between explosions." He never called himself a hero. He said only, "We did our duty. The house did the rest." And maybe he was right, because Pavlov's house became something larger than heroism. It became a metaphor for resistance itself, a lesson that power isn't in size or numbers, but in refusing to fall, even when everything else does. Strategically, its defense didn't decide the outcome of the battle, but psychologically, it became the heart of it. It told the soldiers across the front that Stalingrad still breathed. It told the world that courage can be built out of rubble. Over time, the myth traveled farther than the war itself. In military academies across the world and from Moscow to West Point, officers studied the defense of Pavlov's house as an example of small unit tactics, urban warfare and the power of morale in impossible conditions. They learned that even in the smallest strong point, discipline and structure could hold against chaos. That one well-coordinated squad with conviction and geometry could freeze an entire division. It was no longer just a Soviet story. It was human. Today, the house still stands on Sovetskaya Street, Volgograd, its facade scarred, its memory alive. Tourists visit, children take photos, and veterans sometimes touch the bricks as if greeting an old comrade. The air there feels different, heavy, but calm. Across the square, the Volga still flows, the same river that once carried reinforcements, now carrying reflection. And as the sun sets behind the city, the walls glow faintly red. For a moment, it almost feels like 1942 again. Pavlov's house is still standing today. It is not just a monument. It is like a living organism that keeps the memory of people whose names the whole country knew and those whom it has forgotten. This story is not about the victory, but about the price it cost. And if you listen in the evening silence, you can hear the echo of that day still echoing through the concrete. We are still here,